Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
More questions have emerged about David Cameron's lobbying work on behalf of the Greensill financial company today, with the Sunday Times reporting that he arranged for the company's founder, Lex Greensill, to have a private drink with the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Our political correspondent, Chris Mason, is here. Is this becoming more problematic for the government, Chris?
It is, because 3 weeks in, the headlines keep coming. Now, lobbying, an attempt to influence government by individuals or businesses or trade unions or charities, is entirely normal, a part of the functioning of a normal democracy. But how many people can arrange a private drink with the Health Secretary? How many people can text the Chancellor and get a reply? David Cameron was able to do both of those things. Now, it's important to emphasise he has not broken any rules, but plenty of people are now saying the rules themselves are broken and are asking a bigger question. The sniff test, does this smell right? Does it feel right? So the argument that's now being made by some is that the rules perhaps need to tighten. What are those involved in all of this saying? Well, nothing, as far as David Cameron is concerned. Mr Greensill there is saying via his friends that what he was offering to Matt Hancock was free for the NHS. Mr Hancock's team are saying they acted entirely appropriately and registered that drink and what they talked about with their officials. As I say, we keep asking David Cameron and indeed the ministers he lobbied for an interview. They keep saying no. We'll keep asking.
Chris Mason, thank you.
The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, had a private drink with former Prime Minister David Cameron and the financier Lex Greensill in 2019 to discuss a payment scheme which was later rolled out in the NHS, it's been revealed. It's added to the growing questions surrounding Mr Cameron's role in lobbying for the company, which has now gone into administration. Well, our economics correspondent Helia Ibrahimi is in the newsroom for us. Helia, what's the latest?
Well, the problems keep mounting for David Cameron. Today, we've learned that even before the pandemic, the former Prime Minister was pushing to get Greensill access to lucrative NHS deals. Back in 2019, Cameron and Lex Greensill met Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, for a private drink, as you said. It wasn't declared in the minister's transparency returns and no minutes were taken. An ally of Hancock insists it was a social occasion and therefore didn't have to be declared. But critics say it all adds to an increasingly worrying picture of pressure and cronyism. Today's revelations make the Health Secretary the fourth minister being pressed by Cameron. Treasury has already confirmed that the Chancellor sent personal texts, including promising to push the case. Then you've got the Treasury ministerial team, Jessie Norman, the Financial Secretary, and John Glenn, the Economic Secretary, also being directly lobbied by Cameron. The Sunday Times revelations show that within hours of being rejected by the Treasury, Cameron was able to turn to a long-serving government special advisor, saying it was nuts to exclude Greensill. And this helped reopen talks. And that's the point, Fatima. This daily drip of information lays bare the extent of pressure being applied by Cameron to wrangle taxpayer funds for Greensill, a company he had a huge financial stake in.
So where does all this go from here then, Helia?
Well, Labour would like to see an independent inquiry set up. Parliament opens up and there'll be pressure on the Business Select Committee and the Treasury counterpart to open its own investigation. Remember, while Treasury ultimately refused access to the Bank of England-backed COVID loans, Greensill was able to get guarantees for hundreds of millions of pounds through the British Business Bank, and there'll be big questions there.
Helia, thanks very much for the latest there. Well, earlier I spoke to Sir Alistair Graham, who was chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life from 2003 to 2007. And I began by asking him what he made of these new developments.
Well, it's worrying that a company with the support of an ex-Prime Minister is able to have access to the heart of the government in a way that very few other companies have, in particular when this relationship started when Mr Cameron was Prime Minister.
In terms of what materially happened to Greensill, the lobbying doesn't seem to have had the intended effect. So why does this matter?
Well, it matters because we've seen an ex-Prime Minister operate in putting pressure on the government in an unseemly way. And I think there are important lessons to be learned from this particular scandal, which could influence how we deal with these matters in the future.
Mr. Cameron has so far appeared to stay silent on all of these allegations, and numerous journalists have contacted him for comment, including our programme. Is there any mechanism that can be used to compel him to respond in some way?
Well, that's why I'm arguing for an independent QC-led inquiry in which I think Mr. Cameron would have to respond.
But there's no political will to appoint an independent QC, is there?
Well, that is a question mark over this government. It's in danger of getting the sleaze tag attached to it because there's been this scandal that's come to light. There's been public appointments made without a proper competitive open process. There are a whole range of issues which are attaching to this government, which I think in the long term will do them damage.
That was Sir Alistair Graham speaking to me there about David Cameron.
After mounting criticism of lobbying by the former Prime Minister David Cameron on behalf of the failed financial services company Greensill, the government has announced an independent investigation. Gordon Brown today said former Prime Ministers should never lobby for commercial purposes. Mr. Cameron insists he broke no rules, but admits he should have used more formal channels. He had contacted senior politicians by text messages to their private numbers. Here's our political editor, Laura Kuensberg.
Decisions made behind Whitehall's closed doors affect millions of us and billions of pounds. So there's big business in using contacts and conversations to persuade those with power to act. Lobbying is allowed, but look who once warned it could go badly wrong.
I'm talking about lobbying, and we all know how it works. The lunches.
As an eager opposition leader, he was worried.
The ex-ministers and ex-advisors for hire, helping big businesses find the right way to get its way.
The concerns about him, though, now. There was no sign of the former Prime Minister at his Oxfordshire home today, but plenty of attention on his behaviour, texting the Chancellor, emailing officials, arranging a drink with the Health Secretary. No sign of him in London either, after his work promoting a bank that's now collapsed has been revealed.
Greensill Capital was in this anonymous London office block, and the boss here advised the government during David Cameron's time in charge. But the roles reversed, and at the start of the pandemic, the former Prime Minister appealed to former colleagues to try to get Greensill involved in emergency government-backed loans. One of those he tried to lobby told me it was classic casual Cameron. The former Prime Minister is adamant he didn't break any rules, but a senior lawyer's been appointed to investigate exactly what happened. And it's prompted a wider conversation about whether those rules really work at all.
So what is allowed? Well, when ministers leave office, they are prohibited from lobbying government for 2 years. To take any job during that time, they have to tell an independent committee who checks whether it's appropriate, to avoid the suspicion of reward for past favours or the risk of them improperly exploiting privileged access. But it's nearly 5 years since David Cameron left office. Are the rules tight enough?
Public office should not become the platform for private gain. And I don't really think former ministers and former prime ministers should be engaged in lobbying for particular commercial companies when they're lobbying their successors.
Labour claims the investigation might be a cover-up and is pushing for answers about how current ministers responded. But some Tories also believe clearer rules are needed.
Lobbying is part and parcel of any democratic system. Constituents, businesses, everybody's lobbying the government for things they want or things they think the government should do. The question is, when there are conflicts of interest, how do officials and ministers in government respond? And there isn't nearly enough conversation about this. It's got much too casual.
In theory, there's nothing wrong with trying to change the government's mind. But how that's done in practice matters to how those acting on all our behalf decide. Laura Kuensberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Boris Johnson has launched an investigation into how a company linked to David Cameron secured government contracts. It will examine the former Prime Minister's actions while lobbying the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, on the firm's behalf. And our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan, is at Downing Street. Carl, this is looking awkward, isn't it, increasingly for the government?
Yeah, that's right, Mary, especially as Labour are trying to drag the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, to Parliament tomorrow to answer questions about his conversations with David Cameron at a time when Mr Cameron was lobbying or talking to ministers on behalf of this company, Greensill Capital. Now, we already know that Mr Cameron directly approached both Mr Sunak and a couple of other Treasury ministers about trying to get a COVID emergency loan for Greensill. He also set up a meeting between Greensill's boss, Lex Greensill, and the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, as part of a business pitch. But so far, there's no evidence to suggest that any ministers, any serving ministers, have done anything wrong. And Mr Cameron says that he hasn't broken any of the rules around lobbying. But therein lies the problem, because many people feel that those lobbying rules are just far too weak. And ITV News understands that the independent review announced today will be able to consider strengthening the rules around lobbying, especially when it comes to senior ministers like former prime ministers. Although Labour believe that the whole process of this review is in danger of not being transparent enough, especially as transparency itself is one of the problems it's trying to address.
Carlton and Downing Street, thank you.
Former Prime Minister David Cameron has broken his silence over the Greensill Capital lobbying controversy and admitted that he made some missteps. This follows weeks of criticism over how Mr Cameron lobbied government ministers, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to try and win access to an emergency coronavirus loan scheme for his employer, the scandal-hit financier Lex Greensill. Last night, Mr Cameron issued a statement which says there are important lessons to be learned. As a former Prime Minister, I accept that communications with government needs to be done through only the most formal of channels, so there can be no room for misinterpretation. Well, joining me now is the Senior Conservative MP, Chair of the Liaison Committee, Sir Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard, thank you for being with us. We have now had this written statement from David Cameron. Does that satisfy you? Should it be an end of the matter?
Well, I think what this whole matter really does underline is concern about what happens in government when government is lobbied. By focusing too much on those doing the lobbying, we're missing the point that what we're really worried about is the behaviour of people in public office. And there's been a long culture building up over decades which is very casual, very informal, of which David Cameron perhaps was an unfortunate example. But we've seen the same with a great many other ministers. But the question is, what is going on in the government? Why was Lex Greensill in the Cabinet Office with a business card and a desk and an email address when he wasn't a civil servant, he wasn't a minister, he wasn't a special advisor, he wasn't even a contracted consultant? And I think the public are increasingly concerned about what is known as the revolving door between business and politics.
On the specifics,
it has great benefits.
Do you think there's a question about why the government should have been interested at all in helping a private business to make profit out of payments, including public sector payments? Strikes me as rather surprising.
Well, I've no doubt at the moment I'm on the Public Accounts Committee, we will want to look at this and find out whether this was a good idea. I mean, why isn't the government just paying its suppliers and its contractors on time instead of having to have an intermediary to pay them in advance of when the government pays? But that's a secondary question here. If we're looking at a scandal about lobbying, where is the most concerning lobbying going on? It's the decisions that are being made by ministers and officials. There's the suspicion that people are looking over their shoulder and wondering. I mean, I was chairman of the Public Administration Committee, which looked into all this, and we concluded that there is not nearly enough discussion about what behind-the-scenes conversations might be going on with an official or a minister about a body that they're regulating or they're funding or a contract they're letting or something they're buying. And so often the minister or the official later in life finishes up as a consultant or as a director of that business. That doesn't look very healthy, does it? And yet the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments that looks after how that is meant to be advising people on how they retire from public life and go into the private sector seems to be ineffective at regulating this. So I think we need a whole look at this. We recommended changes to the Civil Service Code and to the Ministerial Code that, if anybody sort of insinuates or suggests that, in a few years' time, there might be something for you, some reward, some job, some employment, some consultancy, you've got to call that out. You've got to report that to your line management or to the Cabinet Secretary. And that kind of implied favours in the future for what you're doing now is, I think, what people are most concerned about.
Are there specific questions you want to ask David Cameron to get his answers to?
Well, I would suggest he's not got the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial interests in post at the moment because there was a resignation at the end of last year. The new person should be invited to look at all this and look at what happened with Greensill as an example, see what can be learned from that, see what procedures and transparency needs to be put in place, and to look at these proposed changes, which we propose from our committee on the advice of leading counsel. What changes to the Ministerial Code and to the Civil Service Code would bring these conversations up to the surface so that at least this is talked about properly in government. At the moment, it's a kind of taboo subject. Nobody wants to discuss it.
And just finally, what should we do about prime ministers who we sort of burn through and they're out of a job in their prime? We don't give them a massive pension. They've got to make a living somewhere, haven't they?
I don't think any former prime ministers ever had a difficulty making a living, and different prime ministers handle it in different ways. I don't think you can ban people from lobbying. You can't use employment law to contract people not to do things long after they've left the employment. I mean, there's a 2-year ban on lobbying very often, but that's about the limit that the law will stretch. People are entitled to make a living after they've left public office. But let's just talk about this more and say what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think what we would all agree is not acceptable is former politicians and former officials using privileged access where they might have a conflict of interest because they have some personal gain to make. And I think David Cameron has ruefully and painfully rather admitted that. But I think if we get sidetracked on trying to regulate the lobbyists, that may well be necessary. But then we're missing the point about what actually goes on in modern government that has so much interaction with business and where so many people are coming and going from the civil service and from politics backwards and forwards into business. That's obviously good to enrich the experience of government, to bring in business experience in that way. But it needs to be, but it's barely regulated at the moment.
Okay.
It needs to be much better.
Stronger regulation. Thank you very much indeed, Simona Jenkins.
Thank you very much.
Bring in our political correspondent, Joe Pike. For a long time, people have been saying we need to hear from David Cameron. We've had this written statement. As far as the immediate crisis for him is concerned, is that going to put an end to it?
I don't think it will, particularly because in the last few minutes there have been reports, Adam, that the Cabinet Office Propriety and Ethics team is contacting all special advisors, seeing if they've had any contact with David Cameron. Now, I suppose this is up for interpretation. The Cabinet Office, as far as I'm aware, have not commented publicly on it, but it suggests that there is now a government investigation in that Cabinet Office into contacts David Cameron has had. We know he's contacted Special Advisor in number 10. We know he's contacted Rishi Sunak, 2 of his junior Treasury ministers, and before the COVID pandemic, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, too. And interesting that Sir Bernard was pretty critical compared to many of his Conservative colleagues who've sort of held back, perhaps because they used to work for Mr Cameron and his government, perhaps because they know that in the future they may be in similar positions wanting to make money out of their role. But certainly last night, both Conservative and Labour MPs very critical of the timing of David Cameron's statement, because it comes at a time where both ministers and shadow ministers are not doing any TV interviews due to the death of the Duke of Edinburgh. And therefore today, I think we're very unlikely to see any Labour shadow ministers coming out to criticise Mr Cameron and that statement as they normally would, because of this agreement not to be as sort of aggressive in public attacks on fellow public servants. I think ultimately Mr Cameron, Adam, needs to do an interview, a sit-down interview with you or Beth Rigby or Sophie Ridge or whoever to really answer some of the questions. Sir Bernard there putting a sort of short list together. There are many questions mounting for him. He's not managed to answer all of them in that statement. His reputation is being damaged, and the reputation, I think, of public service is being damaged too.
Of course, government can't do that much this week because we are in that official period of mourning. Thank you very much indeed, Joe Pike.
So the government has ordered an independent inquiry into the lobbying work by former Prime Minister David Cameron on behalf of the finance firm Greensill Capital, which has now gone into administration. The review, to be led by the lawyer Nigel Boardman, will look into how contracts were secured and how business representatives engaged with government. Mr. Cameron, who has insisted he has not broken any lobbying rules, did say that he should have contacted ministers through, quote, formal channels. Our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, has this report.
It's the next big scandal waiting to happen. I'm talking about lobbying, and we all know how it works.
David Cameron's words a rod for his own back as the Prime Minister caved into weeks of pressure over what's been described as the worst lobbying scandal in a generation. Today, Boris Johnson launched an independent inquiry to uncover any links between his former school buddy, the failed finance firm Greensill Capital, and the government.
There is an issue around sleazing government. The lobbying legislation isn't fit for purpose. It needs reforming. It's too weak. It allows, for example, a former Prime Minister to be an employee of a company, so he's not categorised as a lobbyist, even though he's lobbying.
Before he took office, this was Cameron's pitch.
The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in the ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisers for hire, helping big businesses find the right way to get its way. In this party, we believe in competition, not cronyism.
But after he left Downing Street, it was Cameron who applied the quiet words in ministers' ears, the text to the Chancellor or drinks to win round the Health Secretary. In fact, he lobbied numerous ministers and civil servants to win Greensill access to taxpayer-backed loans, actions that critics say risk tainting the whole government with sleaze.
Clearly, these sorts of accusations of cronyism leave a bad taste in the mouth. And if they're left to fester, then it really can erode that trust. We have to ensure that no one can buy privileged access. That is not fair to other organisations who don't have prime ministers on their payroll, and it's not a way to run government. He knew well that what he was doing was not an appropriate way for a former prime minister to conduct himself.
After weeks of silence, Cameron released a statement last night accepting that communications with government need to be done through only the most formal of channels so there can be no room for misinterpretation. And he conceded that there was legitimate public concern about former ministers, especially prime ministers, accessing government decision makers. But the gist of his lengthy statement is a defence of his role at Greensill, and ultimately, he says, I was breaking no codes of conduct and no government rules. The problem with the Cameron affair is that it comes off the back of discontent about PPE contracts being awarded to companies with cosy connections. I've spoken to a few of Cameron's former cabinet colleagues. They all accept that there comes a tipping point at which these revelations become corrosive to public trust. One source tells me that he would welcome a new code of conduct that would make explicit that all government work should always be done in writing. The scope of the investigation still hasn't been detailed by government, though this is the man who'll be running it, Nigel Boardman, a city lawyer who'll be tasked with answering some uncomfortable questions about just how deep the lobbying crisis goes.
Helia Ebrahimi reporting. Now, earlier I spoke to Dr. Hannah White from the Institute for Government and Lord Miners, who was Financial Services Secretary under Gordon Brown. Both were critical of the body supposed to oversee these issues, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, known as ACOBA. I put it to Lord Miners that nobody in government really has any interest in tackling lobbying.
I think that's probably the case, but I hope that the force of what has happened, the exposure of the Greensill scandal, which is one of the most significant financial scandals in the UK for the last 20 years, will force people to recognise that the involvement of a former Prime Minister was critical. I'm quite clear in my own mind that Greensill would not have happened on the scale that it did were it not for the involvement of the Prime Minister in giving that business credibility.
Has the main problem here been a lack of transparency, that actually we've never really known before, perhaps, what senior politicians were actually doing in retirement, Hannah White?
I think that's a really key point. The rules only work, the rules only have power if there's sufficient transparency. But if there isn't sufficient transparency, and we saw, in the case of David Cameron, he took up this appointment more than 2 years, so after leaving office, so he didn't have to declare it to and there was no other transparency mechanism because he was employed by Greensill rather than being a consultant lobbyist. There didn't have to be any transparency around what he was doing. And it's really, if we have a system which essentially has weak rules and relies on people to follow principles in public life, our Nolan principles, which are, are really an underpinning of our system, if they don't think that anyone's looking, then the incentive to act according to those principles is much, much weaker.
Lord Miners, 1995, Lord Nolan established a set of principles and rules. I don't know what happened to them, do you?
Well, they're regularly referred to whenever you apply for a job within the government sector, even to be a trustee of your local NHS trust, you're asked to recite the Nolan rules, but I'm not sure that they're fully respected in the behaviour of people. Now, David Cameron knew what he was doing was wrong. He knew it was wrong for him to be pestering not only one minister in the Treasury, but 3 ministers. He knew it was wrong that he was able to secure for Greensill 10 meetings with the 2 most senior civil servants in the Treasury. He knew it was wrong for him to have a private drink with Matt Hancock to lobby about contracts which the NHS was awarding in connection with COVID. And there's no doubt about it, because Cameron then goes on to say, well, I knew nothing about the Greensill's business. I wasn't on the risk committee. I wasn't on the audit committee. I didn't know anything about the business at all. Well, what were you doing, Mr. Cameron? Your job was to promote the business, and you were promoting it not because of your experience as a PR man with Carlton Television, but because of your standing as a former Prime Minister of this country.
Hannah White, that is the crisis that we're now discussing. What is the cure?
Well, there are a number of different ways we could go about this. I mean, the normal British way when it comes to responding to a crisis or a scandal is to tinker with the rules and to maybe add, to extend them in this way or to change them in that way. And, I think that would be a minimum approach, that we potentially beef up ACABA, we give it a link to Parliament so that its rules are owned by Parliament rather than by government, and we get it to report to Parliament, that we extend the time for which appointments have to be reported to ACABA and make that more compulsory rather than voluntary. You could also extend the registrar for whom, at the moment, consultant lobbyists have to register what they're doing, but in-house lobbyists don't.
You won't have seen it, but Lord Miners is shaking his head. Why, Lord Miners?
Well, yes, strengthen is the right thing to do. I think we should just be very clear. Former ministers are not allowed to lobby government. If they wish to make communication to government, they should do it through civil servants. They know, John, that is the mechanism to use. They shouldn't be using back channels and text messages to private cell phones. There should be a proper process.
Lord Miners, Hannah White, thank you both very warmly for talking to us. Thank you.